example over here is that Postmates, we had fairly rudimentary implementation when Amplitude was proposed by me. And one of the things that, the VP of Growth actually saw, and, that became the reason why we actually graduated from free trial to the paid version, was that he foresaw Amplitude as a store not just for product engagement, but also for financial information, for partner handshake, how our merchants were doing, how our supply chain suppliers were performing according to our expectations. So it wasn't just really product, but also other functions in the company that were going to provide a unified picture of our cost structure and our unit economics. And that is a thing which he foresaw and sold the VP of Finance on, and we moved that threshold. Now that's pretty much, I'm speaking the language of return. On the investment side of the equation, there's obviously pricing that comes into the picture. I've seen things falter on a couple of occasions just because of some very rigid price structures, not expensive, but rigid. And the best thing the vendors can do at this stage is to promote from their own perspective, not for the customer. But the best thing they can do is to promote this idea of flexibility. So, volume-based pricing, as, pioneered by Mixpanel, has actually been adopted fairly widely and has become standard in terms of how they actually, convert customers to paid usage. I actually have seen Keep Analytics switch over a few years ago to volume-based pricing, and that's where a lot of subjective calls are made inside these SaaS companies. There's really no formula. They actually try to stay opaque about this in terms of how they're going to price our usage. They just see the size of the company, the growth. We have actually done this when I was actually running a SaaS business, not in analytics, but in recruiting. But the best thing they can do to make that hum is to make sure that their pricing does not give this idea of a rigid cost structure to the company. That's almost a no-go for startups, but also for very large companies. It ends up being quite a gating factor.
That, and just to make sure I understand that point, when you say rigid price structure, you mean something that's not volume-based. It's just something that, is a blanket price per month that isn't clear, where that number is coming from. Is that right?
There can be many different ways in which rigid price structures manifest themselves. Like, for example, I once was in a conversation where Adobe Analytics was trying to make a lot of money off of this monthly maintenance fee of something like $1,500 per 5 users or something. That's something they were going to charge regardless of whether we reach out to them or not. They offered consulting hours. That's another way to introduce rigid pricing. Believe it or not, per-seat-based licenses are also now considered fairly rigid because flexible these days is pretty much if our business is not going to grow that much, then why should we pay that amount of money?
Right.
For large enterprise,
right.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. And when you're saying, for large enterprise, is it different for them from that perspective?
So large enterprise on day one have a huge volume that they simply have a hard time justifying in their OpEx. And if they're going to spend money in their OpEx on tools, might as well hire like 10 engineers instead of that and, have them build an internal platform. Pretty much the reason why Facebook has an entire equivalent of this, all the tools that you mentioned, plus a few more. Facebook has their own proprietary tools just for that because they simply would not. It will be much cheaper for them to build it themselves. And there are obviously a few other examples where companies fairly large, like Microsoft Teams, for example, has a fairly large footprint of users, and they're better off using some of their own internal tools to sort of record usage and track user behavior.
Got it. That makes sense. So it sounds like, just to make sure I'm capturing your thoughts correctly, that the biggest thing that sort of companies want to see when just making a decision to go to pay is one, that they get a return from that in terms of value. They're actually getting return on what money they're paying. And then on the investment side, that there's flexibility in the pricing structure. So if they're not using it, they're not just charging monthly fees for no reason.